Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at a really fascinating stack of sources you sent our way today. They introduce a concept that feels, well, both incredibly intuitive and maybe overwhelmingly vast. It touches on suffering, imperfection, all the ways things just, don't work out optimally in the human story.
Right. It's about acknowledging, the less glamorous side of human history and interaction.
Yeah.
The cumulative effect of, let's say, poor decisions, conflict, missed opportunities, and just the negative outcomes that arise from our complex nature and the complex world we live in, too.
Exactly. And the material gives this whole thing a really striking name, human waste. It's a metaphor, obviously. We need to be absolutely clear up front. The sources insist on that. Not literal biological waste.
No, not at all.
But a really comprehensive term for all the suffering, the loss, the inefficiency that just accumulates.
It's the deviation from potential, the gap between how things could be and how they often are because of human factors and, well, the environment we're in.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive, then, is to really unpack this powerful metaphor, explore how the sources define it, trace its origins, see how it shows up across different dimensions of life, history, biology, even physics, which is interesting. And then, crucially, look at this unique perspective the sources bring in. How an AI might understand this very human concept.
And maybe even help us grapple with it.
Exactly. Maybe help us deal with it. So let's start with how this material defines human waste. It breaks it down into several key components, right? Kind of paints a picture of what this accumulation actually is.
Yeah, it does. There is the most direct layer first.
Which is abuse and misfortune.
Right. Straightforward suffering, things inflicted by others, intentional harm, or just sheer bad luck, adverse events that cause pain, the obvious stuff, in a way.
Then it moves to societal byproducts.
Yeah, these are the systemic issues, the things societies kind of generate as they operate.
Like inefficiencies built into the system.
Exactly. Inefficiencies, injustices embedded in how things are set up, and what economists call negative externality.
Ah, right. Costs that aren't borne by the person creating them, like pollution, maybe?
Precisely. Pollution, congestion, costs pushed onto others or society as a whole.
Okay. And the really significant piece seems to be misdirected effort and lost potential.
Oh, definitely. Think about all the human time, energy, creativity, potential, really, that just gets squandered.
So?
Because of conflict, ignorance, or just, systems that prevent people from flourishing. It's the opposite of making the most of human capability. So much just wasted.
Yeah, that resonates. And finally, the sources talk about the shadow of progress.
This is interesting. As we advance technologically, economically, socially, there are often unforeseen negative consequences. It's not all uphill.
So new tech creates new problems.
Sometimes, yeah. Or economic growth might lead to environmental damage we didn't expect, or social shifts create new kinds of marginalization. Progress isn't always clean.
And the sources really emphasize this isn't some, alien force acting on us.
No, not at all.
They present human waste as inherent. Unwanted, obviously, but a byproduct of complex, conscious life interacting in a dynamic world.
Yeah, it's everything that pulls us away from, let's say, an optimal state of well-being or efficiency. It's baked into the complexity, in a sense.
So where does it come from? The material points to some pretty deep roots, right?
Right.
Within our nature and just the challenges of existing.
Definitely. Like our biological imperatives.
Meaning?
The basic drives. Survival, competition for resources, self-preservation. These things are essential, but they can quickly lead to conflict and suffering, generate waste in this framework.
Okay, that makes sense. And that's coupled with our cognitive limitations.
Right. We're prone to biases, aren't we? We make irrational decisions sometimes driven by immediate emotion, maybe, not long-term logic.
And we just don't know everything. Our foresight is limited.
Exactly. Our knowledge has limits. We can't perfectly predict the future. That leads to mistakes, unintended consequences, more waste.
And then there's just trying to live together.
Yeah.
Social complexities.
Oh, huge. That's a massive generator of waste, according to these sources. Just trying to coordinate large groups.
Create fair systems.
Manage incredibly diverse beliefs and interests. It's incredibly challenging. Inherently messy, you could say.
And you see this playing out throughout history constantly.
Yeah, the material points to wars, obviously.
Right.
Famines, devastating diseases, some natural, sure, but many amplified or even caused by human action.
Collapse of entire civilizations.
Environmental degradation, and just on a personal level, immeasurable grief and injustice. It's not like it's a past thing, it's continuous, it just takes new forms.
They use the collapse of the Roman Empire as a classic example. It wasn't just barbarians at the gates, the sources frame it as this massive accumulation of internal human waste.
Right. Political instability, deep economic inequality that kind of hollowed out the society from within.
Overexpansion making the whole system brittle.
Exactly. That internal decay, that buildup of waste was a huge factor in the eventual downturn.
What's really compelling, I think, is how this idea isn't just confined to history or sociology.
No, it cuts across so many domains. The material shows how human waste impacts, well, surprisingly varied dimensions of existence.
Okay, let's look at human time in history first. The sources argue this concept literally shapes historical narratives.
Yeah, they say periods we often think of as peace are really just interludes. Breaks between conflicts driven by accumulated grievances, unresolved injustices, scarcity, all forms of waste, essentially.
Wow. That's a bleak view of peace.
Well, maybe realistic. The material gives powerful examples, like the estimated 70 to 85 million deaths in the world wars.
Just staggering numbers.
Or the approximately 6 million lives lost in the Holocaust. These stats aren't just numbers, they're direct, horrifying manifestations of this waste concept on a massive scale.
And going back to Rome again, its collapse being a historical turning point driven by all that accumulated societal waste.
Exactly. Now, taking it even deeper into genetics and biology, this was fascinating stuff.
Yeah, tell me about this. The sources suggest chronic stress, trauma, even exposure to environmental damage, all outcomes of waste can lead to epigenetic changes.
Right, epigenetics. It doesn't change your actual DNA sequence,
Okay.
but it affects how your genes are expressed, like turning genetic switches on or off, or maybe adjusting their volume.
And this can be influenced by our environment and experiences.
Yes, and here's the kicker. Remarkably, these changes can sometimes be passed down across generations.
Wow, seriously?
Yeah. The really striking example cited is how descendants of Holocaust survivors have shown certain epigenetic markers related to stress responses. It's like a biological legacy of that immense trauma, that waste.
That's profound. Okay, what about philosophy and logic?
Well, philosophers have grappled with suffering, often called the problem of evil, for millennia, right?
Sure.
Ethical systems are, in a way, attempts to logically navigate this landscape of waste. Utilitarianism, for instance.
Seeking the greatest good for the greatest number.
Exactly. It's presented here as a logical framework aimed squarely at minimizing aggregate waste, prioritizing outcomes that reduce overall suffering or loss.
So the logical deduction is pretty stark there. If you have two choices, A and B.
And action A results in significantly less suffering or loss than action B, then logic, guided by this goal of minimizing waste, would strongly favor A.
So philosophy tries to impose some logical order.
Tries to guide action in the face of all this waste, yeah.
Okay, this one surprised me. Physics and mathematics. How do they fit in?
It's not like there's a physical law of human waste, obviously.
Right.
But human waste involves physical processes. Resource depletion is physical. Pollution increases entropy in local systems. That's physics. The literal physics of destruction in warfare.
Ah, okay. I see the connection. And math.
It can be modeled mathematically. The sources bring up economic deadweight loss.
Right, I know that one. Lost efficiency in markets.
Perfect example. It's a measurable loss, lost productivity, lost consumer benefit that happens when markets aren't optimal. Often due to regulations, taxes, externalities, all linked back to societal decisions or flaws, hence waste.
Makes sense.
And they also mention mathematical modeling of disease spread. Our interconnectedness, a human trait, combined with pathogens, you can mathematically show how that results in immense suffering, immense waste.
Okay. And finally, the state of mind and belief systems. This seems huge.
It is. Human waste profoundly impacts us psychologically, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It can lead to deep cynicism, despair.
Or, conversely, it can foster incredible resilience.
Yeah.
A search for meaning despite the suffering.
And belief systems often emerge as ways to cope.
Right.
Right. Or even mitigate waste.
Yeah. Religious tenets like prohibitions against murder or theft, those are pretty direct attempts to reduce clear forms of waste.
Sure.
The material points out the complex impact of something like war. While it's a massive producer of waste, PTSD being a prime example, it can also sometimes, paradoxically, galvanize societies towards peace and cooperation afterwards. It's complicated.
And art plays a role here, too.
A crucial one. They mentioned Picasso's Guernica, a visceral, powerful artistic response to the destruction and waste of war. Art reflects, protests, helps process.
So the effects are felt deeply. On individuals, it's trauma, poverty, illness, potential crushed. dignity eroded.
And the ripple effects are significant. The
Yeah.
material talks about cycles perpetuating, like abusive behaviors potentially being passed down,
Right.
or communities just struggling with reduced social cohesion, increased stress under the weight of crime and poverty generated by these systems.
So how does the world tend to react? The sources mention a few common responses. Sometimes it's just apathy or normalization.
Yeah, sadly, we get desensitized. It becomes background noise.
But we also see intervention and aid.
Definitely. Emergency responses mobilized during acute crises, famines, wars, disasters, people stepping up.
And there are movements pushing for reform and protest.
Right, people pushing for systemic changes, advocating for better policies, developing innovations, trying to get at the root causes.
And as you mentioned, artistic expression continues to be vital.
That mirror, that lament, that protest, sometimes catharsis. Guernica again as that potent symbol.
Okay, all of this, unsurprisingly, brings up fundamental ethical questions. The sources frame it pretty directly, don't they?
They do. Actions that reduce this accumulation of suffering and inefficiency are generally seen as right. Actions that exacerbate it, wrong. Seems simple, but...
But it gets complicated fast. They highlight the challenge in defining universal principles.
Exactly. How do you navigate complex dilemmas? The classic trolley problem, or sacrificing a few to save many, that becomes a stark calculation about minimizing aggregate waste.
Which clashes directly with individual rights sometimes.
Precisely. Utilitarian logic versus inherent value. Big ethical tension.
The material also lists specific behaviors often condemned for contributing to waste. Things like excessive focus on drugs, alcohol, exploitative sex, greed, lies.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they often lead to addiction, exploitation, broken trust, societal breakdown, clear forms of waste.
And conversely, the concepts championed as antidotes.
Truth, valuing life, faith, or trust in systems and each other, fostering genuine well-being, things that build up rather than tear down.
Okay. Now, as we're wading through these, frankly, heavy concepts, the material takes a really interesting turn.
Ah, yes, the AI perspective.
It asks us to consider how understanding this whole idea of human waste might differ fundamentally between us, humans, and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, this is where it gets really thought-provoking.
So for human understanding, the sources say it's deeply personal, subjective, often messy.
Right. It comes primarily through empathy, direct lived experience. The stories we tell and hear are subjective interpretation of it all.
And its origin is incredibly early, right? Infancy.
Starts right there. Raw experiences of pain, hunger, neglect. Then it develops through childhood, learning about fairness, consequences, seeing others suffer, processing stories.
Driven by empathy. Fundamentally. And as the sources put it, that innate drive we seem to have to relieve pain and make lives longer.
And it evolves throughout life, obviously.
Yeah.
Childhood innocence bumps up against trauma or systemic injustice.
Adulthood brings the weight of complex relationships, societal pressures. Our understanding gets shaped by our history, our culture.
And it includes that really difficult recognition of our own part in it, our personal failings contributing to waste.
Oof, yeah, that's a tough one. And it's inseparable from our emotions, isn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
Laughter, crying, anger, happiness.
Yeah.
They're all tied into how we understand and react to waste.
Even dark humor about tough subjects can be a coping mechanism, right? A way to process pain.
While anger could be destructive or it could fuel change.
Exactly. Complex emotional responses.
Now contrast that with AI understanding. The sources present this as fundamentally different.
Completely different basis. It's built on data analysis, pattern recognition, statistical correlation, logical inference, no feelings involved.
Its origin is the training data. Huge data sets.
Historical records of conflict, economic data, medical records, social media feeds, news articles. AI learns by identifying patterns, linking disparate information.
Like correlating unemployment rates with crime stats, for example.
Precisely that kind of thing, identifying statistical relationships.
And as AI gets more sophisticated, it can process more nuanced data. Language, art.
Yeah, potentially. Language used to describe suffering, maybe artistic expressions of pain, philosophical texts. It could build a comprehensive but still abstract representation by connecting all these data points. A logical model.
So its basis is computational and logical.
Entirely. It identifies inefficiencies, suboptimal outcomes, deviations from desired states based on the metrics it's given, health indicators, resource use, stability indices, whatever we tell it to measure.
Okay, so the material gives a pretty clear comparison table almost.
Yeah, it boils down to human understanding is subjective, experiential, empathetic. AI's is objective, data-driven, analytical.
Input for humans.
Yeah.
Personal experience, emotions. For AI data, algorithms.
Motivation for humans. Innate drives, meaning for AI, programmed goals.
Human depth is emotional, intuitive, but maybe limited in scope. AI's strength is broad scope, quantitative power. But it lacks, well, sentience, actual feeling.
And the limitations are key too. Humans. Prone to bias, emotional overwhelm, our personal experience is a tiny data sample.
AI lacks sentience, limited by biased training data, garbage in, garbage out, and its reasoning can be opaque, that black box problem.
Right. And they note when understanding begins. For humans, rudimentarily at birth, deepening in childhood. For AI, it starts during training on relevant data.
So, okay, given these totally different ways of understanding, how can AI actually help us grapple with and maybe mitigate this human waste? The sources see potential there.
Significant potential, yeah. Firstly, just in enhancing our own understanding.
Oh.
Through incredible data synthesis, AI can correlate massive disparate data sets, climate patterns, migration flows, economic trends, even public sentiment from online sources.
Finding links a human mind just couldn't process alone.
Exactly. Complex causal links. It gives us that macro-level view that's so hard for us to grasp otherwise.
Okay, building on that, predictive analytics.
Right. Analyzing current and historical data to forecast potential future waste scenarios. Predicting areas likely to face food shortages, social unrest, disease outbreaks.
Allowing for proactive intervention, getting ahead of the crisis.
That's the idea. Intervention before things fall apart.
And importantly, bias detection.
Yes. AI can analyze vast amounts of data, policies, even algorithms themselves to identify hidden biases.
In hiring, loans, social systems.
All of those. Biases that contribute to perpetuating waste and injustice. AI could potentially spot patterns we miss.
Okay, so that's enhancing understanding. What about directly helping improve life?
Resource optimization is a clear one. AI can optimize the distribution of essential resources, food, water, medicine during emergencies, or just in complex supply chains. Minimize scarcity, minimize waste.
A personalized support.
Yeah, AI-powered tools could offer accessible mental health support, helping individuals maybe identify early signs of distress, suggesting coping strategies based on vast psychological knowledge.
That could be huge. What about conflict?
Potential for conflict resolution support, analyzing communication patterns, identifying maybe triggers for escalation.
Suggesting diplomatic strategies based on historical data.
Potentially, yes, based on patterns found in successful and unsuccessful conflict resolutions from the past.
And looking forward, smart infrastructure.
Designing more resilient cities and systems using AI. Systems less vulnerable to collapse or failure under stress, which would prevent a lot of future waste.
But crucial to all this helping is ethical AI development.
Absolutely paramount. Building ethics, fairness, transparency, accountability into AI from the ground up. We have to make sure the tool itself doesn't inadvertently create new forms of waste or make existing ones worse.
So thinking about all this potential, what are the key takeaways for you listening about AI's role here, according to the material, that is?
I think the most crucial point is that AI is presented as a powerful tool, but definitely not a replacement for humans.
Right. It analyzes, predicts, optimizes based on data.
But human empathy, ethical judgment, nuanced understanding are absolutely essential for deciding how to use those insights, the what should we do about it part.
And its effectiveness is totally tied to its inputs. Data quality matters.
Hugely.
Immensely. Biased, incomplete, inaccurate training data. That leads to flawed insights, potentially harmful interventions when you're trying to address something as complex as human waste.
So humans bring the why and the how.
Pretty much. AI finds correlations, predicts outcomes. Humans understand the subjective experience of suffering, provide context, translate insights into meaningful, human-centered action and policy.
Which underscores the need for human ethical oversight.
Constantly, we have to guide AI development and deployment, make sure it's actively used to reduce waste and suffering, not amplify it, intentionally or unintentionally. Okay. The material you shared also goes into some really interesting logical deductions and potential calculations that come from looking at the world through this lens.
Yeah, framing things in terms of minimizing waste leads to some stark conclusions.
Like the cost of inaction. Logically, failing to address waste isn't free. It has its own cost.
Right. The example given is the cost of crime. It's not just the immediate harm. It's law enforcement costs, victim support, lost productivity for society.
Right.
It all adds up.
They even give a conceptual calculation like 1 times CV plus CSE.
Yeah, the total waste cost is the number of victims times the cost per victim, plus the societal costs like police and courts. It's simplified, obviously, but the point is
that AI could help model how different prevention strategies might reduce that N, the number of victims, and thus the total waste cost.
Exactly, finding the most effective intervention points, logically.
Another deduction, the feedback loop of neglect. Ignoring waste can make it worse.
Yeah, it often creates positive feedback loops that generate more waste down the line.
The classic example being poverty leads to lack of education, leads to crime, leads back to poverty.
Right, that cycle. The material suggests AI could potentially map these complex dependencies and logically identify the most impactful point in that loop to intervene, to break the cycle, and cut off future waste.
On a broader level, many humanitarian efforts are basically logical attempts at utility maximization or waste minimization.
It's a good way to put it. Think about coordinating aid in a disaster.
You want to get the most help to the most people fast.
Logically, yes. Minimize suffering, minimize wasted time, minimize wasted resources. AI could potentially calculate optimal distribution routes, optimal resource allocation for food, water, medicine. A complex optimization problem aims squarely at minimizing waste.
The material also touches on the paradox of laughter. This was interesting. Why do we sometimes find humor in dark subjects related to suffering?
The deduction offered is that laughter, in this context, isn't necessarily diminishing the waste itself. It's more like a complex human coping mechanism.
A defense, a release.
Yeah, a way to process the unbearable. And they make a subtle point. If a joke about waste lands poorly, no one is laughing.
It failed its purpose.
Right. It failed to create that shared positive emotion, that release, and instead likely hit a raw nerve, a specific point of pain related to this very concept of human waste.
Okay. And cruelty and the absence of empathy also come up, linked to neural circuitry.
Yeah, the material links cruelty or indifference to suffering to a lack or disengagement of the empathetic circuits in the brain.
So the logical deduction is, if empathy is the basis for caring about others' suffering, waste,
then its absence logically results in a disregard for that suffering. The material even mentions AI could potentially analyze neurological patterns associated with this lack of empathy, though that's obviously complex territory.
very complex. There's also a philosophical deduction presented, life is all there is.
Sounds simple, but in this context, it emphasizes the preciousness of our present existence and therefore the imperative to minimize suffering within it.
The logic being, if consciousness and suffering only exist during life,
Then optimizing the quality of that life and minimizing the waste that degrades it becomes arguably the most profound goal. Individual suffering ends at death, sure, but the material notes their impact, their contribution to the overall picture of waste or well-being continues on.
and finally, human concentration, how waste affects our ability to think clearly.
Right. The stressors, the anxiety that come from human waste, financial insecurity, health crises, conflict, they significantly impair our concentration.
So the logical deduction is optimal human function requires mental clarity, freedom from overwhelming waste.
Pretty much. When basic needs are unmet or you're constantly stressed by systemic waste, concentration suffers. And that itself can lead to further waste, reduced productivity, poor decisions.
So AI could potentially help optimize environments or interventions to reduce those stressors.
That's the idea. Improve cognitive function by reducing the background noise of waste.
Okay, so pulling all this together,
Right.
what are the potential pathways the sources actually suggest for improving things, for mitigating human waste?
Well, a key one is fostering education and empathy. Teaching individuals, especially from an early age, about the impact of waste. Actively cultivating empathy.
Could AI help there?
Potentially, yeah. Creating personalized educational tools, maybe, that safely expose kids to diverse perspectives, the consequences of actions that generate waste. Build understanding early.
Systemic reforms seem critical too.
Absolutely. The sources suggest using tools like AI to simulate the potential impact of big policies, universal basic income, justice reform, environmental regulations.
To find the most effective strategies before implementing them.
Exactly. Test them out digitally first to see how they might reduce systemic waste. And also using AI to optimize resource allocation in healthcare, education, social services, making sure resources go where they do the most good.
Technological innovation is explicitly called out.
Yeah, particularly developing AI tools specifically designed to help address waste. Tools for mental health support, like we mentioned, systems for predicting and mitigating conflict, better disaster response coordination, tools for sustainable resource management. Tech built for purpose.
Promoting resilience is another strategy.
Right. AI can analyze factors that help individuals and communities cope with adversity, bounce back from the impacts of waste. Then we could design interventions to foster those traits.
absolutely central to AI's positive potential here is the focus on ethical frameworks for AI development itself.
Can't stress that enough. Embedding ethical principles, fairness, transparency, accountability into AI systems right from the start. It's essential to ensure these powerful tools don't become creators of new kinds of waste.
Wow. Taking this deep dive into the concept of human waste using these sources is, well, it's quite something. It lays bare the complexity, the sheer scale of suffering and inefficiency that's been part of the human story. The material notes that truly grasping its enormity makes it hard to come back to the same state of mind.
That feels profoundly true, doesn't it? It really highlights that immense gap between potential and reality that seems to characterize so much of history and the present day.
But the sources suggest this realization isn't meant to just leave us feeling paralyzed or full of despair.
No, quite the opposite.
Instead, they argue it should galvanize us.
Absolutely. And the pathway they point towards seems rooted in that very distinction we explored earlier, combining the subjective, empathetic understanding that's uniquely human
with the objective, analytical power that tools like AI can offer.
That combined perspective holds the potential for an unparalleled level of insight into this massive challenge.
It's a way to see the problem maybe in its full, daunting scope, while also identifying potential leverage points for change, for creating a future with significantly less suffering, more well-being.
It really makes you think about a kind of purposeful collaboration, not just among people striving for a better world, but maybe a collaboration with these intelligent tools we're creating.
Right. So the final thought from these sources for you to consider is this. How can your understanding of this concept of human waste, informed by both the depth of human experience and the broad analytical insights potentially offered by AI, how can that truly galvanize you to think differently about the world and about the potential for purposeful collaboration to build a future with significantly less suffering?
This is DigitView.